Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Anita Huberman. I'm CEO of the Surrey Board of Trade, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon at our Surrey Digital Town Hall featuring a very special guest, Canada's Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan. I'll introduce him in just a moment. I just wanted to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the Kwantlen, Katzie, Semiahmoo, and Tawasin First Nations. Thank you so much to the Port of Vancouver for their ongoing sponsorship of our Surrey Digital Town Hall series. The Port of Vancouver, they trade with more than 170 different countries. And thank you so much to our frontline workers at the port, our marine terminal operators, our truck drivers, our railroaders. They are getting our goods to market locally, nationally, and also globally. Thank you so much to the Port of Vancouver. And just a couple of instructions before we begin. The session is being recorded. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat function and I will get to them. If I'm not able to, then we will respond to them after the session is over. So all attendees, please put your questions in the chat function. I also wanted to let you know that the Surrey Board of Trade is one of 9 organizations that sits on the Premier's Economic Recovery Task Force, identifying gaps and opportunities during the pandemic, but also for economic recovery. And very shortly, you're going to hear from the provincial government on a little bit of an economic recovery strategy to begin with. But of course, at the Surrey Board of Trade, we are hosting Canada's first Surrey Economic Recovery Summit on June 25 and June 26, because Surrey is going to be British Columbia's largest city. And we want to make sure we're ready to ensure that Surrey is an opportunity city, even in the face of a pandemic. The Surrey Board of Trade is also part of the Surrey Economic Recovery Coalition with our local BIAs, local chamber colleagues, and as well, we've involved labor as well. Also identifying gaps and opportunities pre and post the pandemic. And I have a direct line right into the Prime Minister's office, again, providing that on-the-ground knowledge and intelligence, again, for gaps and opportunities. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure, because I'm also an honorary captain of the Royal Canadian Navy, in addition to my role at the Surrey Board of Trade as its Chief Executive Officer, to introduce a very special guest with us. Ladies and gentlemen, he has served Canada and his community as both a soldier and police officer. He has dedicated his time, his volunteer efforts to our country. He was a police officer with the Vancouver Police Department for 11 years. He completed his last assignment as a detective constable with the gang crime unit in organized crime. He was deployed to Bosnia-Herzegovina and served 3 separate deployments to Kandahar, Afghanistan. He has received numerous recognitions for his service. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Canada's Minister of National Defence and also Member of Parliament for Vancouver South. Minister Sajjan, you have the floor.
There you go. Well, thank you very much, Nita. First of all, thank you very much also for your absolutely kind introduction. But before I begin, I do want to acknowledge that normally, if I was in Vancouver, I want to acknowledge the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Semiahmoo, Katzie, and Kwantlen First Nations. And Anita, I want to firstly thank you for your service, not only at the Surrey Board of Trade for as leading the way, but also as honorary captain. It means a lot. Diversity is extremely important for us in the Canadian Armed Forces. And you wearing the uniform as an honorary captain sends a very powerful message to all Canadians. So thank you for your work. So I'm going to give just a very brief outline of what our military plan was to respond to COVID, but also what we're doing. And the reason I kind of want to present this is, if you go back to when we were first watching how COVID was spreading. And this is something for me I have to be very mindful of, because one of my responsibilities is to making sure that we respond to Canadian security as a last resort, because after us, there is no one else. So I was in very close contact with my counterparts from around the world, from Italy, Spain, a number of other countries who were actually dealing with it, with this pandemic early on. And so understanding what they were going through, how they were preparing, it gave me a very good idea of what we needed to do. Now, keep in mind, every country's was going to deal with the pandemic a little differently, but I wanted to make sure that we were ready for the worst case scenario. And so, if those of you might have caught our when we presented the military plan, we put about approximately 24,000 troops on standby to respond. And when I say 24,000 troops, this is not just individuals. This is about a system here where we could actually respond. I'll give you an example. What we needed to do was be able to respond very quickly for any type of COVID type of emergency inside. I kind of break up Canada, the South and the North. Within the South, where a majority of the population is, we had to be able to respond. We needed also a force to be able to respond up in the North, which is a very particular concern for us. Plus, we needed to make sure that we, on the coastlines themselves, we were able to respond to our coastal communities. So, based on this, we put the Army, Navy, and the Air Force, the right assets on standby. We also, for the first time, activated our reserves. Basically, any reservist that wanted a full-time contract was given one, and that allowed us the tremendous flexibility. And the reason I mention this, because in British Columbia, there is no full-time Army presence in British Columbia. There is a Navy full-time presence, but the reserves play a very important role. And in British Columbia, the reserves responded extremely in large numbers, which gave me the confidence that British Columbia was going to be looked after as well. Now, keep in mind also, we had to do this while at the same time we had to be ready for any type of flood situation. And thank God we've been able to get through this period across Canada without any type of serious emergencies on flood. But we're coming into the forest fire season, and we have to be able to respond to that. So now so what we've been able to do with this response is to be able to respond very quickly. Majority of the work that we're doing right now is in long-term care facilities, because in Quebec and Ontario, they weren't as prepared, and we needed to save lives, and that's what we have done now. We've also done work in from contact tracing in various provinces, and providing a lot of background work on the logistics. So what we see is as we were bringing in PPE from around the world, we helped set up the logistics hubs, and to be able to push that PPE out to the various provinces. And now that responsibility is also it's being handed over. So gave us a confidence that inside Canada, the military would be able to respond. And now I'm very comfortable with where we're at. And keep in mind, we had to do this in the context that our international responsibilities needed to be maintained. And more importantly, we had to be monitoring our adversaries, making sure that no one was going to take advantage of this situation. And we had a few situations of this, but we monitored that very closely. And our troops had to keep responding in a COVID-19 environment. And so luckily we have a good system inside, but our medical system is designed to look after our people. So we have been overtasked on the medical system side. A lot of lessons that we're taking in now for any type of future response, but it gave me the confidence that when it comes to any type of emergency inside Canada, we would be able to respond. And then even internationally, we were able to provide support and bringing some of our Canadians back from overseas missions as well. So rest assured that everybody can feel safe that the Canadian Armed Forces is ready. But I'm also particularly interested in, Anita, something you mentioned. The Surrey will be the largest city in Canada, and it's growing very quickly. And I'm mindful of this, is making sure that we have the right support. So I am looking at, as we look at expansion for the reserves, that Surrey is being looked at, and this COVID-19 environment, and if possible, any type of disasters when it comes to earthquakes, something that we are taking very seriously. So I'd love to be able to have those discussions with you to making sure that we suit the security needs of British Columbia and especially south of the Fraser. So I'll just open it up for anything else and questions if you'd like.
Thank you so much, Minister. So I have some questions for you, and then we'll go to the audience questions. And of course, top of mind is the pandemic. And really, what is the role that the military provides to support cities and provinces in the time of a pandemic? Can you expand upon that?
Sure. So what we try to do is in a pandemic or any other type of disaster that comes, so each province looks at how they can respond to an emergency. In this case here, something that fortunately we had some good lessons from the SARS incident that had occurred in the past. And so when a province does not have the ability to deal with any type of emergency, they can then the province can request the Minister of Public Safety for support, basically a request for assistance. And what that does is it puts a formal process in place, and the Minister of Public Safety makes a request to the Minister of National Defense, and then I authorize the support. Now, this may seem like an cumbersome process, but it's not. We actually monitor directly what the provinces, what those concerns are. In fact, and when it comes to any type of emergency response centers in the provinces, we have military liaison officers working directly. So we're already monitoring what the situation is. So when a time that a request needs to be approved, sometimes it literally takes minutes. It's a phone call, a few phone calls that happen, and I'll usually already have the military already on the move. So that way we can provide that direct support. So that's a formal process. But in terms of pandemic, this was very different here. I gave up 3 priorities on how we needed to respond to this based on the right medical advice. First thing we needed to do is, yes, we needed to prepare for the worst case scenario, but our number one goal really needed to be, how do we support the provinces on preventing the spread of this disease? And so we looked at what can we provide. So for example, this is where contact tracing was something very important. We were looking at where are the things we can help with testing as well. The second priority was, how do we support vulnerable communities? Because if COVID got into vulnerable communities, rural communities, or especially up in the north, where they don't have the full support, we needed to support into those areas. So we put a plan into place for that. And the third one was logistics, where we have a system where we can actually provide that direct support. So based on those 3 priorities, we built that larger military plan. Now, keep in mind, if something became worse, we're always ready to be able to respond. The one aspect what people think, though, there's a misconception that we have when it comes to 24,000 people, that they can do everything. Now, keep in mind that 24,000 people also include our pilots that fly our airplanes. Our medical capacity, though, is limited. So we have a medical capacity that actually is not designed to actually go outside and provide support. Our medical capacity is about looking after inside the Canadian Armed Forces. And what people also don't know is, just like Canadians have a healthcare system, we actually have a healthcare system inside the military, which I run, and our medics are there for our people. So what we did was to provide that direct support especially into long-term care facilities, whether Ontario or Quebec. We actually stripped most of our medical capacity inside the Canadian Armed Forces, went down to a minimum in most of the country, so we can surge in that capacity into key areas, then built a team around of non-medical people to be able to provide that support. So it's been very kind of catered support going from province to province. In some cases, many provinces that didn't need that support, but nonetheless, we needed to make sure we had enough people there, and we definitely do.
Minister, Surrey has the greatest number of manufacturers in British Columbia, and they've been open, ensuring our goods are at market globally and nationally as well. But more specifically, you know, we're a trading nation with the United States, China, Europe, etc. But I'm curious to learn as to, you know, what the communication has been with international defense ministers and the collaboration with you in this pandemic.
So Actually, I'll talk about the internal supply chain system and then the international. First of all, internally, we needed to make sure that we have the right manufacturing and retool for what we needed. And I've been extremely impressed with so many companies putting up their hand and saying, "I can retool and do X." And I'll give you an example. I've actually personally got involved with a number of people that reached out to me as member of parliament or as a minister of defense. Um, I knew that we in BC, paramedics, police officers, and firefighters were having a shortage on hand sanitizer, and we needed to speed things up. So there was actually one company that got a hold of me saying that we can retool something, but we need to get approvals from Health Canada to use this one particular chemical, and then they needed some additional approvals. From the time that I got the call, one of the things that we want to do as a government be extremely responsive, and that's what the COVID committee that we've created that I'm a part of in cabinet. I'll give you an example. From the time that I received that information, I was able to push it directly to the Minister of Health, who sent it to her people. The Deputy Minister of Health called the CEO of that company, figured out what it was needed, gave direction into things, got approval for that company for that particular chemical, and I think it was about 3 weeks later they're already up and running now, providing that work. So one of the things I was extremely happy with, the responsiveness from Canadian companies has been really good, and that's been a collaboration of companies themselves, but government actually working together. But the more important piece of something we really need to work on, and we are currently, is I've been talking with other defense ministers of making sure that we have a supply chain, a trusted supply chain that we can support one another. We need to be able to support each other from our own countries first, but then getting into a system of how we can support one another. So we've been working on what are the actual needs each country, what shortages do we have, and then how can we look at where do we have certain skill set or certain industry, so rather than duplicating, we're able to support one another. And when I would say now we're getting into a good place where we can actually look at where Canada can support other nations and how other nations can support us, and particularly in the research side. As Health Canada has been conducting their research, and we have our own research inside defense as well. We changed some of the work that we were doing, took some of those lessons, and we have a facility in Suffield that's been working with the University of Saskatchewan on looking at the antivirals. So taking some of our work that we've been working with some more serious type of pandemics, and we were able to link in our research with them as well. So we've been working on that global research with our partners as well.
Minister, I wanted to focus on your background in policing for just a moment. And of course, the discussion, the dialogue about policing in Canada within cities is really front and center. And I'm curious to learn what your perspective is with your background on the current state of policing within Canada.
I think in Canada, first of all, we do have a system that works well, but as we know and highlighted now very evidently, with Black Lives Matter, and rightfully so, that systemic racism still exists, something that we've known for a long time. But I'm glad that finally we can have this discussion. It's sad that people have to die for us to have a very serious conversation like this. And what we need to do is look at all our institutions. I'm very actively looking at in the military. In fact, actually, last year I launched a review inside the military through our ombudsman, and I'm going to be doing more as well. But within our policing system, and given my experience, one thing we can also be proud of is in Canada, we were trying to embrace, and the reason I know this because when I was going through the police academy, community-based policing was something that were being taught to us a long time ago, and that was a good thing. Is it perfect? No. But this is what it allows us to do, is making sure that we can actually move forward now and look at what are the changes that we need to make. It's not the system that is broken. The system was never designed well in the first place. It's something that we have to have also a wider discussion inside our own society. We can't just look at institutions. We have to look at society itself. because our institutions are representative of society, whether you're talking about police, whether you're talking about military, whether you're talking about business, or whether you're talking about the public service. We need to first, yes, look at all our institutions that we are responsible for. We all have a role to play in our society, but then we have to have those wider discussions in society itself. If you want those institutions to really um, take root, if your society is functioning in a manner that looks at everybody in an equal way, gives everybody an opportunity to succeed regardless of their gender, religion, color, their skin, then our institutions are also going to follow suit. What can we do? For example, I think you've seen this and you've been a champion of this. You being in the position that you hold sets a positive example. But we also know this is not true in our business, in our public service. We need to make sure that all our institutions are a true representative of Canada itself. When we have that, then we're able to interpret all those type of issues. We can have that type of voice where somebody says, "Wait a minute, I don't think you've seen it this way." And we have great champions in all our communities, especially my white friends who supported me when I was serving in the military. And without them, I probably wouldn't have achieved some of the things. But the thing is, a lot of them, they're not going to see some of the things that we have seen. They're not going to be able to see when you walked into a small town or you go into a mall in some place that you don't have a lot of diversity, the eyes and looks that you get, or that people, how you used to be stopped by the police. So to answer your question in a longer way is we can be proud of the policing that we have, but we have not answered the question of systemic racism inside these institutions. But more importantly, because we have not answered the question of systemic racism in our own society itself. And we cannot. And one thing what I don't like is we can't compare ourselves to other countries, because that should not be the test. The test should be our own. And we have a long way to go, but I'm confident how far we have come, that we can get there, because at least in Canada, we're having a good, honest conversation about this.
Thank you so much for responding to that. A very heavy issue for many people within Canada. You know, Surrey has a significant number of military families that live in our city, in the South Fraser Economic Region in total. And in Surrey, with our Health and Technology District, we are building a veterans village, really focusing on PTSD. What is your ministry doing to support your staff around and veterans around PTSD, mental health supports, and the like?
Well, first of all, we actually have a joint suicide prevention strategy with the Veterans Affairs. And I was fully supportive and very happy with when we, with the Veterans Village, that concept that was created. And what we're trying to do here is PTSD is an impact, not just as veterans, it impacts all of society, especially our first responders. And so we're looking at how do we take this work and apply those lessons learned to all first responders. But more importantly, one of the key things that I've been really focusing on is how do we look at research and how do you prevent this from happening? So how do we support our people to build that mental resilience? Because yes, we have to look after our people. That's a given. It's a must. But what we really need to focus on is how do we prevent our people from getting into that situation? So we're taking our lessons on how do we support our people for example, you're talking about families. How do we look after our families? And it's people think that when I always talk about the military, I always bring up the families. The reason I do this is because I want people to know that in our policy now, the families are purposely written in there because it allows us to put the resources to this. Now imagine, regardless of what position we hold in our society, myself or even the Prime Minister, if things aren't well at home and you got kids, how can you be focused on work? Now imagine in the military, when you're asking them to do dangerous, extraordinary things, and situation at home is not going well. So what we focus on when we announced our defense policy is how do we looking at somebody, not looking at strictly from the veteran, how do we see that somebody that joins the military, looking them as a veteran then, so that from the time they get recruited, how are they trained? How are they taught? How is their family looked after? Are we posting them all over the place for no reason? Can we limit their postings to bring some family cohesion? What time, what age group is when military members start to decide that they want to have a family? How can we support them, especially for women? When they want to have kids, want to make sure that having kids is not an impediment to their career whatsoever. So we're trying to answer all those things. So when you put all this together and how we're looking after veterans, what we want to do is look at how do we support them right from the beginning and build that mental resilience. And I can assure you that the concept that's been created in Surrey, I'm really keen on seeing how this is going to progress, because that concept is a little bit far beyond, further than what we originally talked about. And there will be more to say. I'm already looking at the research on what type of military footprint we actually need to have in Surrey as well.
Well, we hope you can be at our opening ceremony when the Veterans Village is eventually built. I think hopefully next year it'll be ready. But I wanted to just change the topic to long-term care homes. And one of our attendees thanks you for your work with the Canadian Armed Forces and your work with Quebec and Ontario, and the need that was needed with long-term care homes. How are you, as Minister of National Defense, ensuring that information is delivered to provincial ministers of health to mitigate this long-term healthcare crisis so that change actually happens?
So first of all, I want to say is we actually took a lot of information from British Columbia on their lessons learned, and looked at what are the changes that needed to be made in other provinces. So being part of that committee, I was able to learn what's happening in other provinces. And one thing that in BC, what was done well was how control was taken over the facilities, of the private or public, making sure people didn't move around. So there's good protocols that were put into place. Also with the making sure the benefits and pay was also sorted out. So that helped to give an idea of what we needed to do. And I'll be honest with you, besides for visiting long-term care facilities, didn't have the experience in there. So we had to learn very quickly. But what we have done now is, and I think this has been well known, the military reports that we have given back to the province that are been made public from Ontario and Quebec of what we have been seeing. And this was very important. We gave direction to our soldiers early on, was to making sure that we kept a good record of what was happening, observations, and so that we can actually look at how do we fix things. And that's what we've done. Is we have those reports, we've given it to the provinces, they have been made public, and all the other provinces can have access to that. But one thing that we definitely have learned, and is not, when you look at how long-term care facilities are run, when we have arrived in some of these facilities, what we did was bring confidence. One of the issues what we found was that some of the workers did not feel safe working there, because we were able to bring in a system, look at how you wear PPE. First of all, making sure that there are some facilities the PPE was actually locked up and wasn't being shared. Now, what we've been able to do is when we were assigned long-term care facilities, we had our own criteria that was designed, and based on that criteria, we got to work, not just working in the facilities, but how do you get it back to being independent again? And so what we've been doing is we have learned that you can take a critical facility, what we considered at the red, within about 19 to 22 days, we can turn that facility into green, which includes infection rate going down, making sure people are back to work, taking all the responsibilities, making sure there's PPE there. So we've worked on very good criteria with Ontario and Quebec, and we've been going, so rather than just staying in long-term care facilities for a long time, we've been actually trying to make them better, and it's worked extremely well, and we've been trying to share those lessons with others as well.
Excellent. That's good to hear. Tell us about how our internationally deployed troops are how are they being protected from the COVID-19 pandemic?
No, that's a very good question. We had to move very quickly on this. Fortunately for us, when we deploy, we always deploy with a full system in place that includes medical personnel. And given that this has been a pandemic that impacted all countries, so there's certain things that we were normally doing, for example, capacity building training to other nations. Well, that was going to stop. So if there's no soldiers to train, there's no need for us to be there. So we started moving people into key areas, and in some cases, we actually moved them out of the theater back into Canada, kept them safe in Canada, and we can always go back in. So we did that in this case, for example, in Ukraine. Um, Training was not going to be happening, so we left enough people there to making sure that we have kept maintaining a footprint, but it brought everybody else back. We had brought them into a self-isolation in Trenton and in Kingston, kept them safe. And then now that training is starting to resume, some of them have already started to deploy back. And what we've also done now is making sure with the people that are there that we actually have the right medical personnel, the right number of medical personnel, that they have the protective gear and the right protocols are in place. And we do have to be mindful that some of the work that we do is we want to respect the physical distancing, but some things we can't. So what we did was we've actually had to learn on our own, and I was extremely proud of the work that our military leadership, what they've done. I'll give you an example. When we need to deploy a ship, it's impossible to have physical distancing on a ship, but we still have our operation to conduct, and we had ships too needed to go on the coastline if we needed to respond. So what we had to do was that entire crew for the ship had to be isolated for 2 weeks before they went on the ship. And so we had to take extra steps. But what that did was guarantee us now, anybody who's going on the ship was going to be COVID free. Now we had a ship ready to go to be able to respond. So that's what we have been doing in various theaters. And keep in mind, we have troops all over the world, it's even in Africa. So we had to make some very quick decisions, make some adjustments. But more importantly, what we were also able to do is all our missions, we were able to continue to accomplish them, even in a COVID-19 environment.
When we're talking about the military and technology and innovation, and one of our attendees referenced before the pandemic, there was an ideas challenge that was launched. Tell us about military innovation, even we're in the midst of this pandemic, but is that still under consideration?
In fact, actually, it's one of my top priorities that I focus on. When it comes to innovation, it is one of my priorities that I put to the Canadian Armed Forces. And in innovation with this pandemic, our people were able to very quickly start adjusting some of the work. And I already talked about some of our defense research and development work on the antivirals that we have been working with some of our other international partners. And we have a great a lab in Suffield that has allowed us to work at let's put it this, the highest levels of chemical warfare. And so with that experience, we were able to provide that resource, but we also have our own innovation that we were able to start. For example, we had to start looking at very quickly in case we had to move personnel who were infected. We now have purchased systems that we can actually put into our aircraft to be able to transport people. We also have mobile hospitals. So we have been doing a lot of things where we could respond, but more importantly, look at some of our research money that we have. How do we apply it into this COVID-19 environment? Some of the things were almost automatic. I'll give you an example. Simple things like non-medical masks. We have, I think, bases across the country. I literally just started making masks. In fact, actually, I took one because wearing a turban, it's hard because I can't put it around the ear. And I had a pullover, and within an hour, I met some of the troops I was in Shearwater, and they were able to make me a mask that worked for me. And so the ingenuity that our people bring to the table is quite impressive. But the innovation piece, if you just give me the opportunity, rather than just even from a pandemic side, my vision for the military is to the ideas program is one aspect of our innovation. We do a lot of research and development with some very high classified work. But what we want to do is get into a place is research is always happening. It shouldn't be this, oh, we need to do more on innovation. It needs to become evergreen, that we're continually investing into the key areas, but investment into research is useless without developing the talent. And that's something that I'm very keen on is how do we develop Canadian talent to take advantage of this? So in addition to the Innovation Ideas program, we have a Minds program, which actually taps into the academics. We have now increased our interns program as well. So we do a lot of interesting work also outside of defense. I am also responsible for the Communication Security Establishment, which is our signals intelligence and also our cyber where the specialty lies. So in there, the reason we are so good in the cyber field and we have this tremendous talent is because we've been able to recruit. And so we've been trying to emulate what CSE's been able to create. And my goal out of this is as we look at creating the right structure for research and development that'll connect into the Canadian defense industry, what that's going to allow us to do is rather than us looking at we're the only ones that can come up with the solutions for defense, what we want to do is tap into the great minds within our Canadian industry. And that's what the Ideas programs is about, is throwing challenges out to Canadian industry and even including even individuals with an idea. And if you compete the idea, whoever wins it, we'll invest in you early. Work up a prototype, you get further investment, and then we want whether it's a product, a software, or a solution or on something. And then what that allows the company to do is look at how they can then progress, connect into ISED's program, and help take that their small little company into the bigger market.
So the current Canadian government has really invested in a national shipbuilding program, you know, something that was so desperately needed within our nation. Do you think with all of the support programs that are absolutely needed for residents and businesses, do you think the shipbuilding program on both coasts of our nation is going to be compromised?
In fact, actually, not just, well, I'm going to be talking about not just the national shipbuilding strategy, but all our defense investments. All of it is actually protected because we need this for the military. It's extremely important because Canadian sovereignty and defense does not stop regardless of what's happening inside Canada. And our sovereignty up in the north, especially in the Arctic, is extremely important to us. Plus, we also need to be mindful of the work that we do internationally prevents conflicts or reduces conflict. And we need to remain involved in those areas there. We have adversaries who want to take advantage of this current situation. So when we launched our defense policy, we as a government made a decision very early on that the policy, when we launched it, wasn't just going to be approved by government as a policy, that the money had to be attached to it to give confidence that this policy actually can work and survive. Previous policies, great policies, were conducted in the past, but the problem was it didn't have money attached to it. Essentially what had to happen was every single year, the Minister of National Defense had to make a request for money. By that time, viewpoints changed, situation changed, or governments changed. And then the policy itself was, well, okay, you had the policy, but you made a different financial commitment at the end of the year. What we have done as a government, looked at a 20-year horizon. So we launched a defense policy in 2017. We looked at all the costing for the various programs we needed in the defense policy, carved out the fiscal framework for future years. And so this defense policy has all the money set aside for it to be achieved. So future governments would have to make a government level decision to change this course. So it can't be that we're not going to get money next year. It literally has to be a government level decision. So the national shipbuilding strategy is protected, but all the other programs are also protected as well. And the reason being is this is not just about, this is about looking after our people, but I think people also understand now the military, we have a footprint across the country. Yes, we're in Vancouver when it, with C-SPAN, we're in Irving, but when we look at the footprint of the direct and indirect jobs that the military brings, whether it's a base, on an infrastructure project, or a procurement project, it's massive. So what this is also about creating great job, high-level job opportunities for Canadians. The national shipbuilding strategy, and in particular with this surface combatant program, for every dollar spent into and invested into this program is a dollar that's invested into our economy. So it has a massive impact, and this is why it's so important that when we look at people look at defense spending, this is not just defense spending; it's about investment, defense investment, so that we can actually create the jobs, but more importantly, create those opportunities for those bright ideas and Canadians who are developing that talent, so we can compete on the international stage as well.
And really is part of Canada's economic recovery strategy as well, to provide those good quality jobs and support families.
In fact, actually, sorry, just one, sorry, if you talked about the shipbuilding strategy. There's actually a company in BC. So they're building the Arctic offshore patrol ships in Halifax, right? But the bridge design and the work that's being done is actually, it's a company out of BC. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of great work that's happening across the country on just this one particular program.
And I mentioned earlier that Surrey has the greatest number of manufacturers in British Columbia, and we actually composed a position paper on the need for the Canadian government to have an Arctic strategy, not only related to defense, but also really from an economic lens. But from your perspective, how are we positioned in the Arctic in the face of China, Russia, the US also being there?
So first of all, you raised a very good point. And the Arctic, we have this sense of what it's like. Um, but when you actually get up there, like I've been up to Alert, it's the most northern habitable place on the planet. And that to go up to the north is almost equivalent of going east and west across Canada. And our sovereignty up in the north is when I look at it, is not just strictly the military. We have people who live up there, Canadians who live up there. So we have a responsibility to them as well. So that sovereignty, when we look at it from that lens, it means even more. So when we launched our defense policy, we conducted a analysis of what we needed to look at the north. So investments have already started. For example, we purchased additional Arctic offshore patrol ships. The Coast Guard actually bought 2 more. We've put more satellites, 3 satellites that were just launched by SpaceX, and we have 2 more projects in the works. We're doing some very interesting work for below the ice, underwater. We're looking at certain basing needs up in the north. So the work has already started. But in this mandate, before COVID, something we call NORAD modernization, or we kind of look at it as continental defense, we needed to upgrade a lot of our systems. But reason we didn't launch that in the defense policy, because that's a discussion that has to happen with the US. And something that I think Canadians are not aware of, but they would be very proud of, when we look at NORAD, they look at NORAD as just only tracking Santa during Christmas time. But NORAD itself, and for example, Cheyenne Mountain, NORAD is the only binational command in the world. And what that means is it's not just a command that we're part of. It's a treaty level agreement between 2 countries where the commander of NORAD is always US, but the deputy commander is always Canadian. The selection for the NORAD commander position cannot be approved. So it has to be approved by the Secretary of Defense. It goes to the president, but it also has to be approved by me and the prime minister. The deputy commander of NORAD, same thing. Prime minister makes the approval as well through me. And then it has to be approved by the US as well. And the reason being, NORAD itself, you had the commander has the ability to, for example, if there's a need for a response up in the Arctic, has the authority to respond, launch our CF-18s up in the north, and also within their own space as well. So it's that's why it's a binational command. It has a treaty level agreement for it. And the reason it's absolutely so unique is that we are actually part of this. This is not a separate thing. So to modernize this, we know that it was designed some time ago. We need to look, when we look at modernizing it, we're looking at basing up in the north. We're going to look at what our response is needed, what future equipment is needed. When we look at the threats, we look at the threats all the way from space right to underwater. Where is the research and development going to go? And one caveat that I have put into this is that any investments and work that we're going to be doing, the question we always have to ask ourselves is, as we do this, how does it benefit the Canadians who live up there, Inuits, communities who live up there? How does it benefit them? How can it be dual purpose as well? So we have started the groundwork for this. And before COVID, we had started some work, but keep in mind now, we're going to look at this through a very different lens now too, because we need to look at this through a pandemic lens. So we need to look at it. Could we have responded up in the north? What do they need now? If there's a future pandemic, would we be able to respond? Do we need to look at having more permanent basing up there? So we're looking at search and rescue capability. We're going to have brand new, by the way, search and rescue aircraft arriving in BC very shortly. It's going to revolutionize how we conduct search and rescue. But as the Arctic is opening up, regrettably with climate change, we need to make sure that we're able to respond there. But the key takeaway for this is for especially our businesses and manufacturing is we have the ability and we have the knowledge base to be the leaders here. So if we do this well, that we'll be able to have an edge against anybody from around the world. And I think this is where the ingenuity really comes in. And I want to also say is anything that we do in defense when it comes to the work that we do from a procurement perspective, we have laid out a defense investment plan that looks at goes out 20 years so it gives predictability for companies to look at which projects are coming up and how if they wanted to bid for it, when they needed to bid for it, and what type of investments they need to do early on so they can be competitive.
My last question to you, Minister, is around the topic of cybercrime. I know the Minister Bill Blair, he focuses on it as well, but just was wanting your perspective because, many people are working from home. They're doing business at home, and cybercrime is on the rise from an international level inside our nation. And I was wanting your perspective on that, number one. But number two is, of course, in the United States, they're facing an election this fall. They might have international interference in their election cycle. How is that being prevented within Canadian elections as well?
So I'll go back a bit. First of all, we have tremendous capability inside Canada. And I mentioned to you earlier that as Minister of National Defense, I'm also in charge of the Communication Security Establishment, which is a separate agency. And under Bill C-59, CSE now is, instead of getting its authority out of the National Defense Act, has its own act now. And what that allowed us to do was actually bring our policies in line with the capabilities that we actually had. And I'll give you an example. So for example, the investments that have been made on developing talent is extraordinary. Unfortunately, the work that they do is at the highest level of classification, so we can never talk about it. But what they provide is the confidence that our systems are going to be protected. So for example, we created the Cyber Center of Excellence, which CSE runs. And so before, I'll give you an example. We didn't have the legal authority. We had to wait for a cyber attack to hit us in Canada. So it literally, if I can use it, we literally had to hit us first for us to take any action. And sometimes we knew that attack was actually about to be launched. And all this allowed us to do was then try to protect ourselves. By that time, sometimes it's too late. So now with the new CSE Act, what we've been able to do, what we're able to do as a government, is look at not only protect ourselves better, but we can actually, when we see an attack, we have the ability to shut it down before it happens. But we also now have the ability for offensive cyber, something that also allows us to create a message of deterrence for any adversary that might want to, interfere in our elections. During the last election, these agencies were directly involved. We had a good system in place where they monitored what was going on, and we were very fortunate. We did not have um, any type of interference. We were monitoring a few things, but our elections, I think we went extremely well. But now moving forward, though, as you know, in a cyber environment, that technology changes rapidly. And so we're making the investments inside to making sure that we stay current. And I know that businesses are taking this seriously. And this is something maybe yourself and also a lot of the companies that are with the Surrey Board of Trade can take advantage of, is that now CSE through the Cyber Center, we also through our are able to actually provide, offer advice to companies on what they need to do to be cyber safe. So what we want to do is we do monitor. We know when companies get hacked or get hit, and we can help them out. We will always do that. But what we'd like to get to into a place is make all our companies is very strong on cyber. And to do this, rather than looking at cyber as afterwards, when you kind of have a company that's been developed, is look at it from day one, making sure that the company is protected, have all the systems in place so they can be protected. And the other thing that we're also pushing is making sure that the average citizen gets greater knowledge on how to be cyber safe. And since I've been a part as Minister of National Defense, CSE has been actively working all the way right down to schools, making sure that parents have knowledge on how to protect their kids from cyberbullying, making sure that what type of apps they might be downloading, and up to including, like I said, all the way up to where there's national security at risk, and CSE can get involved to making sure that we provide that level of protection. So this is something that is extremely important. So as we talked about innovation, the cyber piece is extremely important to our country from a national security perspective. But one thing I can say, because we have the right talent, we have the right research also happening at the same time, that I think this is one area that we can actually lead I would say the world on, especially when it comes to, as we look at artificial intelligence, machine learning. So there's a lot of things that we need to still do. And one aspect that we're pushing a lot on right now is quantum computing. And we know that D-Wave is a company in Burnaby, but also Waterloo has a center as well. So we're making sure that we're putting the right focus in those key areas so that we can take advantage of it. And what that allows us to do is be able to share that knowledge with Canadian industry. And by the way, this is not just defense industry. This could be your small business store in any part of Surrey.
Well, I think cybersecurity before the pandemic by the business community was considered as an afterthought. And now it's finally being taken seriously, and something that we've been quite high profile on that front. And certainly Simon Fraser University here in Surrey with their new quantum computing institute, and we're building the next downtown core of British Columbia, will be an absolute asset to the Ministry of Defense. Any final words for the audience today?
Actually, just before the even final words, what I'd like to do is, if you're interested, I'm happy to put your folks in touch with some of our experts at the Cyber Center. Happy to provide some of that advice. In fact, the program, Langara was setting up a program as well, and they talked to some of our folks and to making sure that the program was going to be prepared well. And so our folks are very keen to be able to help early on if it's ever needed. And finally, I just want to say thank you for your great leadership. And I know you have been hosting a lot of these type of meetings quite often. And finally, I know how difficult this has been for Canadians, and I'm just so proud to see how seriously that they have taken things. And I've always said this: any type of crisis comes up, human beings, especially Canadians, have come together and figured out a way to keep life going. And I mean, having meetings like this, who would have thought would be doing these type of things? And I can guarantee you, as we do this, we're making sure that the right advice from a cybersecurity perspective is there from the military. But more importantly, for us, what's really important to making sure that the average Canadians who's impacted by this, that you know, they're going to be able to have food in the fridge for themselves. And we as a government will work very hard to making sure that not only they're looked after, but as we look at restarting the economy, that we do it in a manner that's inclusive for all. But more importantly, how do we take this experience and look at what type of Canada that we want to build, and to bring it back to what you talked about and on the issue of racism. That's a conversation that we really need to have. I've always said is, you know, none of us should be defensive about this conversation, but have an honest conversation and look at moving forward, so that in Canada, when we talk about diversity, we can truly say that we look at everybody is looked upon in an equal manner and given opportunity for our kids to succeed.
Well, Minister, we're so proud of you and your service to Canada. And thank you so much for being with us here this afternoon at the Surrey Board of Trade Surrey Digital Town Hall. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you to the Port of Vancouver for your ongoing sponsorship. Ladies and gentlemen, make it a great business week. Thank you.